Okay, a real good practice is to always kind of keep your students guessing about what is coming. In other words, you're starting the Middle Ages. A lot of times we associate the Middle Ages with the Dark Ages. This dark period. Ask students why they think it was called the Dark Ages. Give them a chance to answer. Use the dice. That way, students are forced to answer, and they can't just quote unquote hide in their seats. Um, as they give answers, don't really tell them if they're right or wrong. Let them kind of build towards getting the right answer in terms of, well, the belief is that after Rome fell, there was this dark period of history where nothing really happened, which is why it's called the Dark Ages. It was a whole lot of fighting. There wasn't a whole lot of luxury. People were namely focused on survival. And therefore, they weren't building great aqueducts. They weren't building great temples and buildings like that. But towards the end of the Middle Ages, you get to the construction of a lot of major churches. Now, what I did was, and I'm sure you can see my screen, I just pulled up, questions for middle schoolers about the Middle Ages. You could ask students how long they lasted. Why is it called the Middle Ages? And of course, the answer to the first question is it lasted primarily from 476 or 500, some would say, up until roughly 1500. The Renaissance is kind of the end of the the Middle Ages for the most part. Typically, when we start with the Reformation, is when we start the beginning of modern history, modern European history. And remember, modern European history technically starts in the year 1648 with the Peace of Westphalia. But you can ask, why did people call it the Middle Ages? And you can make a wisecrack in terms of, well, was everybody middle aged? Try to ask some of these questions to them, write them up on the board, put them maybe in groups of two or three, and have them to come up with their own answers. Don't allow them to look anything up, and allow for this to kind of spark some creativity. And then after, the groups or the individuals have a chance to go through and answer these questions, then provide the correct general overview questions. Now, I'm not exactly sure about your curriculum, but typically the way the Middle Ages are studied is the rise of the German societies, which are largely tribal based, the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths, the Vandals, and others. And that's normally kind of a real short unit in terms of, these were the folks that conquered Rome, that caused a lot of problems for the Romans. The second part normally transforms to the rise of the Franks. You, of course, would start with Charles Martel, Pepin the Short, and then, of course, Charlemagne. And with each one of these questions, for example, with Charlemagne, you could ask the students, well, why do you think he was called the father of Europe? Is it because he had a bunch of kids? And I realize with middle schoolers, that can go down a very slippery road real quick. But it would give you a chance to see, number one, where their brains are, and number two, where you can fill things in. And you probably, I'm assuming your classes are about 50 minutes long. So what you could do is you could try to have like 3 thought-provoking questions per class. And when I say 3 thought-provoking, it could be more than one at a time. But you kind of start class off with a quick refresher of what happened the day before. You start with this a question or two that you want the students to ponder. Then you discuss that information. Then you provide another question. Again, have them, whether you want it as individuals or groups, or if you just kind of want to rotate it or flip it around, provide the information, and then do the third question. That way, you're kind of dividing class into roughly 15-minute segments, plus your first 5 minutes that would be used for review. Again, you can see here, middle-aged questions for kids, questions and answers. Clicking on this particular website, there is a video here. You have questions about knights. Typically, after you talk about Charlemagne, you start the discussion in medieval society hierarchy. And again, I don't know what your book does, Amber. So I'm trying to, do it the way that I do it in class. But then you start, medieval hierarchy. And you can talk about how people go to church every day during the Middle Ages. You can talk about the knights. A really cool thing to do is to have students, well, what do you know about medieval knights? And then, of course, it's not the same period of time because it's much later in history. But what do you know about Japanese samurai? Because the Japanese samurai existed during the Japanese Middle Ages in terms of the Middle history. You could spend a lot of time talking about castles and things like that. What did they eat? They largely ate bread and dairy products. That was about 95% of their diet, with about the other 5% being a combination of meat and seasoned vegetables. What did they dress? How did they dress? What did they wear? And as you're going through this, and I realize that you can't see my face anymore. I'm sorry. Everybody knows you would want to see my face. You can ask questions in terms of, well, as you see right here, this one, people, did they use toilet paper? What did they use? It's kind of a really crazy, silly question, but it's one that if you think about it, in some ways it will make middle schoolers giggle. And again, some of them might kind of go down the road a little bit, but it's more thought-provoking. You then typically, after the rise of the Franks, you talk together about the beginning of the rise of Rome, where the popes start the process of rebuilding Rome. And at the same time, what's going on in England? What's going on that little island? And these confederation of German states that we eventually will call the Holy Roman Empire. And then you kind of fast forward to the Crusades. Why were the Crusades? You could ask questions, about the Knights Templar. The Knights Templar is one of the most interesting groups of people ever. In addition, kind of from the Crusades, or right before the Crusades, you could kind of do it either or, depending on how your book does. You could talk about the rise of the Vikings. I like the Viking William Ragnar tried to conquer England. And of course, there's Leif Erikson and his dad, Eric the Red. Did the Vikings really discover America? And the answer is sort of, but they only had a colony in Nova Scotia for about 10 years that they left and they never came back to. That's why we study Columbus, and there's such an emphasis put on Columbus later. So, and then typically from there, you get into what a lot of times is referred to as the Age of Destruction. Technically, the Renaissance starts in Siena and Florence before the plague and before the 100 Years' War hits. However, the plague and the 100 Years' War definitely interrupt the Renaissance. So you could kind of look at, the plague. compare the plague to COVID, and how, hey, only 1.5–2% of people that get COVID die. But if you got the plague, 9 out of every 10 people died, just to show the difference. And you could talk about, hand washing, sanitation, how it was dirty in Europe, with people literally emptying human waste out their window and animal waste in the in the streets. You could talk about bathing, and how, for the most part, people didn't bathe very often. And then you can get into, eventually, well, the plague, and then the 100 Years' War, namely, that's the age of Joan of Arc. And, you can talk about, she's somewhere between about 14 and 17 years old. There's some speculation there. You could get into the question of, why don't we study more women in history? Why are there not more Joan of Arcs and things like that? And then at the conclusion of the 100 Years' War in England, you have the War of the Roses, the war between the House of Lancaster and the House of York. The House of Lancaster, I think, was a white rose. York, I think, was a red rose. I don't have the information in front of me, so I might have flipped that. And in a sense, Henry Tudor of Lancaster wins, and thus starts Tudor-Stuart period, and you're starting to get into quote-unquote modern British history. And then you can cover the Renaissance. What was the Renaissance? The Renaissance was the rebirth of the classics, the rebirth of Greco-Roman culture and Greco-Roman style, and education. Building, people wanted to enjoy life, and how, a lot of people that survived the plague, they no longer wanted to work and die. They wanted to find some part of enjoyment in life, and thus they start the process of the Renaissance, buying paintings, decorating their homes and things like that. Of course, not all poor people could do that, but they would try to have their portraits a lot of times sketched on paper, which of course means it doesn't last. But people were trying to find a way to enjoy the good life. And then that kind of concludes the Middle Ages period. Other topics that might be in your book, I don't know, is the fall of Byzantium, or Constantinople in, I think it's 1453 or 1456. You could talk about, the rise of gunpowder, innovation, technology. You could have students, what do you think are like the 5 most important technological advancements of the Middle Ages? It could be, they could say the printing press, the clock, the mechanical clock that we get during the Middle Ages, gunpowder, improved magnification of lenses, amongst numerous others. And again, you could have students kind of do a little bit of this in group work, where you kind of, you could give them a list, where I normally have my students look this information up. You probably don't want your 7th graders doing a whole lot of looking up on their phones or their tablets or whatever, unless you have a whole lot of control. You could definitely talk about witchcraft and wizards and stuff like that. Odds are these kids are probably a little bit interested in Harry Potter. Just a whole host of other things. And again, you can find a lot of those answers right here. And this is just one particular website to try to help you out. I'm going to kind of go ahead and conclude this video. I hope this is helpful. I realize I've talked really, really fast. If it is helpful, then I'll try to do more for you. If it's not, you tell me, and I'll try to figure out another way to help you. Okay?